Now we are going to the thematic session, Deep Water Habitats, with the only presentation of the master student of School of Forest, Fisheries and Geomatic Science, University of Florida, USA, Amy Oxton. Please, Amy.
Yes, hello.
Yes.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, and we can hear you as well.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be presenting at my first ever GeoHab conference. And this is work that, some preliminary work from something we're working on, which is the high resolution habitat mapping of cold water corals and sponges in the northern Gulf of Mexico. So where is the Gulf of Mexico? We were fortunate enough to have the GeoHab committee split up these conferences so we could all get an opportunity to present, but this means that we're kind of all spread out all over the place. So my study takes place here, also in the American node in the Gulf of Mexico, which is partially encircled by the United States, Mexico, and Cuba. This data footprint that you see here is the study area, and today I am giving my presentation from Gainesville, Florida, which is at the center of that red star. So why is it important to look at the communities in the northern Gulf of Mexico? There are unique depth zonations in the Gulf that each play host to specific benthic communities. Cold water corals and sponges have colonized this hard bottom substrate to produce habitable three-dimensional substrates or structures that are very important for fish and invertebrate species. They can provide protection from corals, or from currents, as well as predators, and provide spawning and nursery habitats. They do have very slow growth rate, so any anthropogenic impact stands to make a very large ecological impact. Of all the anthropogenic impacts these corals face, the most important is the oil and gas infrastructure and exploration in the northern Gulf of Mexico. Bottom trawling and sedimentation are also of a large concern. In the Gulf, there are some areas set aside for this coral and sponge protection, and it is called the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. And although this area is set aside, it is completely encircled by this oil and gas infrastructure. So you see here in yellow is the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary. It is split up into three parts. Right here we have the Stetson Bank, and then we have the West Flower Banks and the East Flower Banks. So looking at this holistically, it's not a lot of area that's conserved for how many oil and gas infrastructure there are. So for this project, we set out to map predictive cold water coral and sponge distributions in the northern Gulf of Mexico, and then identify suitable areas for marine protection with respect to oil and gas infrastructure. Our presence data for corals and sponges was collected from NOAA's open access data on their deep sea data portal, NOAA standing for National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they used remotely operated vehicles to collect grab samples and images that were then identified to the lowest taxonomical level by personnel at NOAA. Due to limitations associated with getting down to the species level, we chose to group our taxonomic brackets by order. So we resulted in 5 orders from the phylum Cnidaria and 4 orders from the phylum Porifera, which you can see here in the figure are presence points, and that outlined data footprint is the study area for this project. I would like to note that at the time we collected this data from the NOAA's website, Gorgonacea was still being recognized as its own order. It has since been, further studies have revealed that it is actually part of the Alcyonaceae order, and so our future projects will reflect that change. Our study area was limited by the environmental variables and layers that were available to us. Luckily, we were able to use the bathymetric data that was from the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, or BOEM. This represents the highest resolution bathymetric layer for the northern Gulf of Mexico. It was created using 3D seismic surveys, and it represents a cell size of 40 feet or 12 meters. And from this, we derived several terrain attributes, which we then built a correlation matrix for to verify any covariation. And this resulted in 4 different environmental variables, which were slope, general curvature, easternness, and northernness. We then took all of our layers and put them into a maxent model using maximum entropy modeling systems. And we chose to use the default parameters as they have been shown to perform as well as the fine-tuned parameters. And then to cross-validate, we use bootstrap sampling with 10 replicates as well as jackknife analysis. The individual models were also validated using area under the receiver operator curves, or AUC scores. Here you can see the results for our peripheral order species distribution models. At the bottom is the scale going from 0 to 1, which is the probability of occurrence. And in the bottom left-hand corner of each figure, you'll see the AUC score for that respective model. It is interesting I would like to point out that the Haploscleridia order is not on here, and that is because it produced an AUC score of 0.5, which could be a result of the very low sample size. You can also see that Listasonida does prefer to be in a little bit deeper water than the post-Lisclerida order, just showing the preference differences in these orders. And here we can see the results for the Cnidarian order species distribution models. Again, a lot of variation between the different order preferences, with Scleractinia being very concentrated on that continental shelf, and then Pennatulacea and Alcyonacea being a little bit more spread out along the continental shelf. There was a good, for the most part, the percent of variable contribution was predominantly bathymetry and slope, although the Gorgonacea and Tetractinolicida orders were a little bit more spread out and even with the other environmental variables we did use. So to be able to say what areas we actually wanted to preserve or propose for conservation, we chose to reclassify into habitat suitability models. So we chose a probability of occurrence of 0.6 or 60% and higher. This is pretty highly debated in the literature. What's a good probability of occurrence? We did choose a rather lower value just because our interest is in conservation. So we're hoping to propose conservation for the most amount of species. We then used a reclassification function in ArcGIS to convert to a binary index of suitability that you can see here above. We have an all Cnidaria model, which includes all of the data from the phylum Cnidaria. And then in the bottom, you can see our probability of occurrence model for that same, all of the Cnidaria. We did do this with every model, but due to time, I'm not going to show you those now, but if you would like to see them at the end of the presentation, I can pull that slide up. So now on to the interesting part, to identify suitable areas for marine protection with respect to oil and gas infrastructure. As I've mentioned several times, the main goal of this was for conservation. So to be able to conserve as many species as we wanted, we combined all of the phylum Cnidaria and all of the phylum Porifera data into one model that we referred to as the combined habitat suitability model. So this model was also run through Maxent under the same parameters with the same environmental variables, and it includes every data point that we had in our study. So oil and gas infrastructure. Again, this was open access data that was retrieved by the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's a very robust data set. It includes pipelines and structures that are active in the Gulf, proposed or planned to be implemented in the near future, removed and decommissioned. So removed had an actual removal date, and then decommissioned pipelines are no longer in use but remain in the Gulf. It is important to note that these decommissioned structures could be acting as artificial reefs, giving some actual substrate for the corals and sponges to grow on, although that was not a part of this study. We were then left with 1,771 active structures, 234 of those being proposed, and then 4,100 active pipelines, as you can see in black in the bottom figure, and 55 proposed segments. To identify areas that we did not want to set aside for conservation, we chose to employ buffer zones. Cordes et al. In 2016 identified that habitat up to 2 kilometers away from oil or gas infrastructure can feel damage if there is something that goes on that oil rig, like if there's an explosion or a leak or something. That impact is usually felt up to 2 kilometers away. Again, with an interest in conservation, we tried to look at the 2 kilometers while also doubling it to a 4-kilometer buffer to have a little bit more room in case of a human error that could cause a rupture of one of the pipelines. Here I'm using the Florida Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary as an example. So in the top figure, you can see where the garden banks are in relation to our study area. with no pipelines visible. And then in the bottom image, you can see them again outlined in black, with the 2 kilometer buffer zone is that orange color. So it's surrounding the pipelines and structures. And then the 4 kilometer buffer zone is in red. And that is also obviously around the orange because it is double the size. So we took these different scenarios and we're going to put them on our combined suitability model. So we have scenario A with no buffer, scenario B with the 2 kilometer, and then scenario C with the 4 kilometer buffer. So here you can see our suitable area scenario A with no buffer. The color swatches that you see represent different areas based on their size, their total size. As I move through the different scenarios, it's pay close attention to the blue areas that represent greater than or equal to 100 kilometers in size, because those begin to shrink as the habitat fragments more with the oil pipelines. But with this, we did have 3.5% of our study area as suitable habitat, as defined by the 0.6 probability of occurrence and higher. So I'm going to move on to the 2 kilometer, and you can watch some of this bluer areas start to disappear. And that is because we've added that 2 kilometer buffer. And when we do that, we see a 20.34% impact on that habitable structure from the last figure. And this is what was recommended by Cordes et al. But now we're going to move on to the 4 kilometer one, which is what we proposed to preserve as much area as we can, or yes. So here, they're very dwindled down, and our pipeline impact percentage is now at a 37.2%. And this really shows you the habitat fragmentation and ecological impact that these pipelines can have, especially if there's a leakage kind of like the ones that we have seen in the Gulf and all over the world. But what's interesting about this is we were able to identify 9 areas that were still above the 100 kilometers squared area. And with this, we are proposing that these 9 sites be included in the Florida Garden Banks, or to be created as their own national marine sanctuary. Again, they are all outside of this 4 kilometer buffer, and they are all greater than 100 kilometers squared. We used a convex hull to completely encircle the areas. And in the bottom left-hand corner of each figure, you can see some values. The first one is the total suitable area for that convex hull. And then the second number after the slash is the total area of the convex hull itself. So if all of these, in a great world, if all of these were to be implemented, this would protect 5,195 kilometers squared of area in the northern Gulf of Mexico that are outside of a 4 kilometer buffer zone from the oil and gas pipelines. What is really interesting to note is that this proposed area D is actually right next to the West Flower and the East Flower Garden Banks. So this could promote some ecological connectivity and genetic diversity for those broadcast coral and sponge spawners. So in conclusion, we were able to make spatially precise habitat maps from that BOEM bathymetric data, which is the first time that bathymetric data has been used in this way to date. And then we were able to create 9 proposed conservation sites. And it's really exciting to hear that other people are also interested in preserving this area. NOAA actually, on January 19th of this year, 2021, expanded the Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary from its previous area of 145 kilometers to 414 kilometers. The new area that has just been set aside is outside of our study area though, so that doesn't really change the areas that we are proposing. These maps and then proposed sites can help fuel discussions between stakeholders and policymakers as we're all trying to attain the best environment out there. And this is a preliminary work, so there are some few things that we're going to be moving forward with, and I'm very happy to be here and hear all the work everyone else is doing. It's giving us some great ideas. So in the future, we're going to be working with this, doing some ensemble modeling instead of MaxSet and in addition to MaxSet, as well as adding some extra performance metrics like sensitivity and specificity. And then looking at the spatial and taxonomic resolution, so the trade-offs between lower taxonomic resolutions, lower sample sizes, or higher taxonomic resolutions and higher sample sizes. And as I mentioned, we will also be regrouping that Gorgonacea order into the Alcyonacea order to represent the current taxonomic distinctions. And with that, I would like to thank these agencies that provide open access data that has allowed me, and I'm sure other people, to create projects that we would not have been able to without. My email is here if you have any questions after this period. And thank you all for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you so much, Amy. Very nice talk. You developed a very good work integrating biological data with several taxonomic groups, bathymetric, oil and gas infrastructure. So I was just curious to know how was your greatest difficulty, your challenge to develop your work?
I would say the greatest challenge was being constricted by the environmental data available. In a perfect world, you know, it would be nice to have temperature, salinity, or some of these other layers that other students have presented. But as this is a rather deep area, we were limited by what was available, and they only had surface temperatures. And the bathymetry that we had, that layer was such a high resolution that we really wanted to focus in on that. So we were really limited by what we could actually derive from it. But a substrate would be something really, really cool to look into, would be have a higher or a nice substrate layer to be able to incorporate into our thing.
Yes. Let's see the chat. From Virli, with regards to the potential conservation site candidates that you would propose, would it make sense to propose them with their own buffer zone to make sure they have a clear buffer from any future infrastructure that may be planned, built?
That would be, it would make sense. It definitely makes sense. I'm not sure how the oil and gas companies would necessarily think about that. It does make the most sense to have that area set aside. And I'm not entirely sure, as you remember the one image from the flower garden banks, I don't know what was there first, if it was the pipeline and then the sanctuary or vice versa, because that would be really interesting to see how they had done it in relation to what we might be able to propose. But if they had their own buffer site around them, are you, never mind, sorry. I think it would be very helpful, yes. And Alex, I see your hands raised?
Yeah, I have a question. And just first off, great talk. I really enjoyed that really close connection between the science and the management implications. So that was really great.
Thank you.
You mentioned for your final model, you did all the species together. I was wondering how you think that would compare, or if you've thought about doing it where you take your individual models and take some kind of average, like a mean or a sum across those different layers versus fitting that one model with all the species together.
Okay, so that is something that we're hoping to address in the future. That was definitely a weakness, is just kind of throwing them all in one. We're also looking at the ensemble modeling, maybe other things that could be a little bit more fine-tuned. Unfortunately, we didn't go out there and collect the ROV, so some are with the ROV, so we're really limited on what variables we have present point-wise. Mm-hmm. So some orders are very robust and others are very small. So there might be, some overfitting with the ones that have more sample sizes, but that's something that we're going to attempt to take into consideration as we move forward with this to get a final area, but very close to your work.
Well, thank you.
We have another question from Brian. Oil and gas infrastructures is breathtaking. Gary Green will want you to write a paper for the CSR special volume.
I would be honored.
It's an invitation.
I would be honored.
A question from Benjamin Music. Really great talk. Have you experimented with optimizing the presence threshold to ensure that presents are predicted preferentially?
We have not experimented with that, but that is definitely something that I'm going to note down to look for the future. Oh, that would be, okay, yes. So that would be done through kind of an ensemble modeling technique, and that's what we're kind of hoping to do moving forward. It's a really large study area, and it took our models, I think, 3 weeks to run through Maxent. So before we run them through an ensemble model, we're really trying to hammer out the methods and the pros and the cons before we put them in and have to wait a very long time for them to come out. Brian, I see any pushback from the oil and gas industry. I'm going to be pretty humble and say I don't think they know that we exist. I don't think we're on their radar at all. This isn't in publication anywhere. It's still a work in progress. So I don't think that we are anywhere on their radar at the moment.
He said, thanks. A question from André Carlos Boni. Great talk. Your proposed conservation areas were already impacted by previous oil spills?
No, I don't believe they were. Not any major scale oil spills that we have seen any records of. I don't believe that they're in location with I want to say, I can't remember the name of it, but the big one that happened in the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Louisiana. I don't believe that was anywhere within an area of ours, but they're also still looking at that. There's plenty of funds out there for looking at how far the oil had actually spread throughout the seafloor. But to my knowledge, it wasn't our areas, but I also this was just an open access project. So we weren't able to actually get out there and operate any of these things or go see for ourselves.
Okay. One more question to Emily. No. So thank you so much, Annie.
Thank you.